Leaders, they can be incredibly charismatic, maybe brilliant, sometimes holding everything together just by sheer will. But, well, they're human. They pass away. And that's the fundamental challenge, isn't it? For any big organization, any civilization, really, how do you make sure the whole thing doesn't just crumble when the visionary leader is gone? Because if your government, your whole system, depends only on the genius of one person, well, that's fragile. It's inherently unstable. What's truly fascinating and honestly kind of astonishing when you think about the history is what we're diving into today. We're looking back 14 centuries to the early expanding state under Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and we find a system, a structure, being deliberately built to stop governance collapsing by essentially decoupling it from the individual leader, making it about the institution. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, our mission is to really analyze these structural blueprints for continuity. We're digging into cases 61 through 70 from our source material, Prophetic Governance, Institutional Continuity and Knowledge Transfer. We're basically looking for the operating manual, the constitutional decisions made back then to preserve expertise, stop those disastrous power vacuums, and, well, build systems that could actually handle a crisis.
That's absolutely right. And this deep dive really brings us straight to, I think, the core finding, the game changer in this research. The model we're examining, it was fundamentally institution-based. It wasn't built around a personality cult. It was designed with real foresight to make sure the essential functions of the state, the courts, the treasury, the administration, kept going. And how? Through clear constitutional rules about continuity, careful documentation, and critically systematic knowledge transfer. The priority was building a machine, essentially, that could run effectively no matter who was actually at the controls at any given moment.
That distinction, the system over the individual, wow, that feels incredibly relevant today, doesn't it? Whether you're talking about a tech startup or, a global superpower. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's jump into what you call the immediate fixes. When a leader's away or focused elsewhere, what absolutely has to keep running without interruption? I guess it starts with trust, right? Justice.
Exactly. If justice stops, even temporarily, or if the courts just shut their doors because the top person is busy, well, public confidence just vanishes instantly. The whole social contract starts fraying. And our source material hits this head-on with Case 61, the Judicial Substitution Procedure.
Okay, Judicial Substitution Procedure. That title itself sounds surprisingly structured, modern, almost. It suggests a formal, maybe even written process. What did it actually require?
It was an explicit constitutional mechanism. It wasn't just informal. It mandated the immediate appointment of temporary but fully authorized judges whenever the main judicial authority, the prophet, peace be upon him, wasn't available, maybe due to travel, a military campaign, or other vital administrative tasks. But the key wasn't just, finding a replacement. It was the formal, explicit, documented delegation of judicial power. This power went to highly qualified companions, so it transformed what might seem like a temporary gig into a fully recognized constitutional act.
That's critical, isn't it? The delegation itself wasn't casual. It wasn't just, hey, could you cover this for me? It was a mechanism designed to keep the whole judicial system legitimate. But here's the tension, I suppose. If you delegate judicial power quickly, to maintain continuity, how do they make sure the quality of justice, the fairness, wasn't sacrificed just for speed? Expediency can be dangerous in law.
That's the exact balancing act, yes. And the source suggests the answer lay in pre-qualification. These substitutions, they weren't given to just anyone. They went to individuals who had already shown, often through documented track records, a deep grasp of judicial principles and procedures. Plus, their rulings could often be reviewed later, when the primary authority returned. So accountability was built right into the substitution structure. The mechanism provides the speed, but the commitment underneath is that justice must never halt, and it must always remain high-quality justice.
So it's not just about speed. It's about formalized trust. Trust in proven expertise ready to be activated like flicking a switch. You can see the parallels today, can't you? Like special courts activated in emergencies, or the formal process for appointing acting judges when needed. Stability really does seem to hinge on delegating authority without compromising on the quality of that authority.
Absolutely. So if justice is that moral core that can't pause, then administration is, well, it's the operational engine. It ensures the state actually functions day to day, collecting taxes, paying soldiers, keeping records straight. This brings us neatly to Case 64, the administrative continuity principle.
Okay, so we're moving beyond just filling temporary gaps now. We're looking at the structure itself. How do you design the administration so it's inherently stable, even with changes?
The source really emphasizes institutional memory here. The principle ensured stability by relying on the continuity of established institutions and, crucially, their standardized procedures. This deliberately shifts governance away from relying on one person's memory, which can be flawed, right, or their personal preferences.
Right. So the established routines for the key parts, the Treasury, how the courts kept records, the protocols for distributing aid or resources, all that shows the focus was really on writing the how-to manual for the state, making it repeatable.
Yes, exactly. The explicit lesson drawn here is quite stark. Systems are superior to individuals, meaning a well-documented process will simply outlast and usually outperform relying on individual brilliance alone, especially over the long haul. Think about the Treasury, for example. If the process for collecting taxes and paying expenses is standardized, documented, then changing the person in charge of the Treasury doesn't grind the whole economy to a halt. That critical knowledge resides in the institution, in the building, so to speak, not just rattling around in one leader's head.
But isn't there a risk there? This focus on process, on standardization, could it make the administration too rigid? Especially if the state is growing fast, doesn't it need agile leaders who can improvise, adapt quickly? Could institutionalization actually stifle needed change?
That's always the potential trade-off, yes. But the source seems to imply that this initial institutionalization provides the vital foundation for stable growth later. You build the standard railway tracks first, you know. Charismatic leaders might provide bursts of speed, sure, but the standards ensure that momentum is channeled legally, ethically. Rigid documentation, in this sense, actually prevents arbitrary decisions. That's a form of resilience itself. It creates a baseline expectation of how things are done. And for long-term survival, that's often more valuable than short bursts of, let's say, improvised brilliance that might go off the rails.
That's a really strong defense of, dare I say it, bureaucracy, making the system itself the keeper of history and process. Okay, and this leads us logically to those moments of high-stress, unexpected change, which is covered in Case 63, the Transitional Governance Framework.
Exactly. If Case 61 handles temporary judicial gaps and Case 64 covers the routine systems, Case 63 anticipates the really unpredictable stuff, the high-stress voids, like what happens when the leader has to leave on a long military campaign, or immediately after a major battle when administrative control could just evaporate in the chaos.
So these are actual structured measures put in place specifically to maintain order during those periods of extreme absence, whether planned or unavoidable. What specifics do the sources offer about this framework?
The emphasis was heavily on preparing before the event, preemptive readiness, and clear, structured delegation of duties immediately before and sometimes after major external events. So before setting out on an expedition, specific individuals were formally assigned administrative control, security oversight back in Medina. They functioned essentially as a temporary caretaker government, but with predefined mandates and authority. This wasn't just delegating a task like watch the shop. It was delegating systemic authority within a pre-agreed framework.
The core lesson here seems to be proactive anticipation then. Governance shouldn't collapse just because things get uncertain, because the plan, the framework, was already in place before the uncertainty hit.
It's like the governmental equivalent of a military's continuity of operations plan, or CO. Instead of trying to manage chaos reactively when the unexpected happens, the administrative structure, the lines of authority, maintaining civil order, it all becomes almost automatic based on the plan. And this emphasis on pre-planning the framework before the uncertainty is really what sets it apart, I think, from many modern transitions that often struggle precisely because they lack this kind of ready-made structure for the what-if.
Pre-planning the chaos and structuring the response. Well, I say that really covers the immediate and routine stability well. Now, let's shift gears to what might be the ultimate challenge for institutional continuity, the transfer of political power itself.
Yes, this is where we move into the truly proactive principles, designing systems to manage the biggest risk factor for any political entity, that complete leadership vacuum, which, of course, invites challenges from both inside and out. We start this planning phase with Case 62, leadership succession planning.
Right, so we're shifting now from just temporary substitution, like in Case 61, to permanent political replacement. That requires much more depth, much more constitutional weight, I imagine. What does this planning actually look like?
Well, the sources indicate systems were explicitly designed to prevent the power vacuum itself from becoming the main event. This involved providing, well, maybe generalized, but still clear guidance on how to choose qualified successors. It wasn't about naming the successor necessarily, but defining the process and the qualities needed. It moves the whole conversation out of the realm of just personal preference or ambition and into an institutional discussion about qualifications, readiness, and what the system actually needs going forward.
So it's not just an emergency plan tucked away in a drawer. It's about embedding a process right into the constitutional fabric. The lesson, then, is the absolute critical need to prevent instability before it even starts by defining that path forward.
Precisely. That vacuum is the most volatile point in any system. It invites conflict, opportunism, institutional paralysis. By having predefined guidance on the qualities, the competencies needed, guidance reinforced perhaps by publicly training potential leaders, you drastically reduce the scope for confusion and infighting during that most critical transition moment. This kind of systematic preparation, you could argue, is the real root of modern governmental succession laws or emergency leadership protocols. They're all designed to ensure a smooth, non-disruptive handover.
Planning the handover is one thing, but ensuring it's peaceful. That's the crucial next step, isn't it? History is full of states that had succession plans but still descended into conflict. This must be where Case 66, peaceful transition of power, comes in.
It speaks directly to institutionalizing nonviolence, yes. The absolute necessity for a consultation-based nonviolent succession was treated as paramount. The historical precedents established clear mechanisms for future caliphs, the successors to be chosen by the community through shura, consultation.
Okay, sure. We hear that term often. It's the engine for building consensus. But in this specific context, how does the source present it as a mechanism for peaceful transition? What's the link?
Well, it functions as a structured process, a forum, really, for resolving disputes among the leadership elite. And critically, the process itself confers legitimacy on the outcome. I mean, if you look at the major powers nearby at that time, the Byzantine Empire, the Sassanid succession was frequently bloody, determined by court intrigue, poisonings, military coups. Establishing shura as the default mechanism meant political energy was channeled towards dialogue, scrutinizing qualifications, building consensus, rather than immediately reaching for weapons. The lesson seems clear. Unity requires dialogue, not conflict. And that dialogue has to be institutionally required, not just optional.
That's a powerful idea. It shifts the basis of the decision from maybe a personal claim or a family claim to an institutional agreement, one rooted in community consent. It sounds like a remarkable structural safety valve. And this whole architecture, planned succession, peaceful dialogue via shura, it seems to culminate in the highest level concept for governance, legitimacy. Which brings us to Case 70, comprehensive succession protocol and legitimacy.
Yes, Case 70 is really the synthesis. It pulls it all together. It provides a holistic constitutional framework where the successful outcome, that is, a legitimate transition of power, depends on several interlocking criteria working together. Because authority is only durable, ultimately, if the people being governed and the administrative elite running the system accept it as rightful, not just something imposed by force.
Okay, so what are the specific pillars of this legitimacy outlined in the source? You mentioned 3 key elements earlier.
That's right. They seem to be the 3 non-negotiables for a legitimate succession. First, shura, the mandatory consultation process we just discussed. Second, piety, meaning the required ethical and moral standard expected of the leader. And third, competence, the practical administrative and executive skill needed to actually run the state effectively.
Wow, that framework is incredibly robust when you lay it out like that. It dictates the process, shura, the character, piety, and the capability, competence. If any one of those pillars is weak or missing,
then the legitimacy of the whole succession is potentially undermined.
Exactly. If the selection process produces someone competent and pious, but it bypasses shura, ignores consultation, it lacks that vital institutional consent. Conversely, if you use shura but end up selecting someone who lacks basic competence, well, the system's likely to fail administratively, regardless of how they were chosen. So Case 70 really links Case 62, the planning, and Case 66, the peaceful process, together. It shows how the new leader steps into a role that's validated by this rigorous, multifaceted constitutional framework. And that makes the succession itself profoundly resilient against internal challenges and dissent.
Okay, so we've secured the immediate administration, and we've architected the political handover, the succession. The final piece, then, is the long game. How do you actually crisis-proof the system? Ensure its ethical quality, its knowledge base, stay intact not just for one transition, but for generations. Let's start with maybe the most fundamental resource for endurance, knowledge itself, institutional knowledge. Case 67, institutional knowledge transfer. This is absolutely critical for long-term survival, isn't it? If knowledge just stays informal, anecdotal, or locked up in one person's head, the institution is doomed to experience these cycles of collapse every time a key person leaves or retires. Case 67 details the systematic, formalized passing on of governance knowledge, from one leader to the next, one generation to the next.
Can you elaborate a bit on how this was formalized? Was it more than just, say, mentorship? Is there something like a structured curriculum?
Yes, the sources really emphasize formal training, specifically in specialized fields. Companions weren't just given general advice, they were explicitly trained in things like judicial procedures, military strategy, and, critically for continuity, administrative documentation and financial management. This established a kind of professional, specialized expertise base, a precursor, you could argue, to a formal civil service. And beyond training people, the very act of establishing administrative registers, official documents, the early versions of the Diwan served as a physical repository of institutional memory.
Ah, that's the difference, isn't it? Between maybe a master craftsman mentoring one apprentice versus creating an entire engineering school. The lesson is really powerful. Knowledge must be institutional, not just personal. It has to be codified, written down, taught, so it can be scaled up and reproduced reliably.
Absolutely. I mean, think about the challenge in modern government today. That constant tension between career civil servants who hold the institutional knowledge and politically appointed leaders who often bring more transitory expertise. This historical model seems to have explicitly favored codifying knowledge to prevent the whole system from being reset every time a new political group took charge. It aimed to institutionalize professionalism from the start.
Okay, professionalism requires knowledge, but it also requires ethics. Let's talk morality.
Yeah.
In any organization, especially during stressful times like transitions, ethical standards can slip. People start invoking political necessity as an excuse. Case 68. Leadership accountability during transition seems to push back hard against that idea.
It really does. This is like the moral backbone of continuity. The core principle here is that ethical standards and the enforcement of the rule of law must be upheld rigidly, even, and perhaps especially, during the most volatile periods of succession or political change.
So the message is, morality cannot be suspended just because things are politically convenient or difficult. Why is enforcing accountability during the transition phase specifically emphasized in the sources? What's special about that moment?
Well, transition periods are just magnets for ethical lapses, aren't they? Power is shifting, lines of authority can get blurry. There's a huge temptation for outgoing officials or even incoming ones to misuse resources, grant last-minute favors, settle old scores before the new setup is fully locked in. By documenting instances where leaders were held rigorously accountable regardless of the surrounding political upheaval, you cement the idea that integrity is absolutely non-negotiable. It proves the rule of law applies equally during stable times and during times of change. And that's fundamental for maintaining public trust. Without that trust, the legitimacy we talked about in Case 70 just collapses.
That high standard of integrity, that accountability, it actually builds structural resilience, doesn't it? Which is precisely what seems to be addressed in the design of the governance structure itself. Let's look at the institutional shock absorbers with Case 69. Governance stability mechanism.
Yes, Case 69 tackles how you crisis-proof the institutions structurally. How do you design them to inherently resist the concentration of power, which is often the root of instability and abuse?
By building in some friction, right, between the different centers of power, what we now call checks and balances.
Precisely. The core mechanism described is implementing specific checks and balances across what were then the three most critical pillars of governance: the Treasury, controlling the money, the military, wielding the force, and the judiciary, interpreting the law.
Okay, we need the mechanics here. How, for example, was the Treasury specifically kept separate from, say, the military command? What was the functional friction built into that system?
Well, the independence of the Treasury, even in its early form, seems to have been paramount. A military commander couldn't just unilaterally dip into public funds for campaigns or personal use. Disbursements typically required administrative sign-off from a designated treasurer or administrative official. Similarly, the judiciary operated with a degree of autonomy, meaning military or executive actions could, in principle, be questioned legally. This separation aimed to ensure that no single individual or temporary crisis group could simultaneously control the money, the army, and the legal justification for their actions. The lesson is clear. Institutions must be built to withstand turbulence, and a key way to do that is through structural resistance to centralized, unchecked power.
Those functional safeguards, the idea that The person holding the sword doesn't also control the purse strings. That really is the institutional architecture that provides resilience, isn't it? Without those checks, the system is just fundamentally brittle, liable to break under pressure.
And finally, there's the challenge of sheer scale. As the state inevitably expands geographically, how do you stop it from fragmenting? That's the fate that eventually destroys so many empires. This is addressed in Case 65, interregional coordination.
Right, governance has to scale, but distance naturally breeds independence, which can lead to fragmentation. What methods did the sources detail for keeping that structural connection strong between the center and the provinces, the periphery?
Case 65 really focuses on making sure the provinces stayed functionally and structurally tied to the central governing body. And the key mechanism was mandatory, regular information flow. Specifically, it required frequent, detailed reports and regular communication from the regional governors back to the center in Medina.
What kind of information are we talking about in these reports? Tax collection figures, judicial rulings, local disputes needing central input.
Pretty much all of the above, it seems. The reporting system acted like a centralized feedback loop. Governors would report on revenue collection, which ensured the central treasury remained cohesive and aware. They'd report on significant judicial decisions, helping to ensure a standardized application of law across different regions. And, of course, security concerns. This systematic reporting prevented regional governors from gradually becoming, independent rulers in their own right. It ensured that continuous coordination preserves unity across a wide territory. You could see it as the administrative lifeblood, keeping a geographically dispersed state cohesive and preventing the central government from becoming isolated or ignorant of what's happening out on the edges.
It really does sound like an early blueprint for a kind of centralized federal reporting system. A vital necessity once you realize that administrative distance can be just as dangerous to unity as political rivalry. Hashtag tag outro. Wow. Okay, this deep dive into cases 61 through 70, it's really provided an astonishingly detailed constitutional blueprint for organizational endurance. We haven't just looked at abstract principles, we've explored the actual mechanics of how longevity was engineered. Let's try and synthesize these collective lessons one last time just to lock them in. We saw survival required immediate stability, built on two pillars. Justice that never stops, case 61.
Yeah.
And administration built on reliable systems, not just individuals, case 64. And these were backed up by pre-planned responses to sudden volatility, case 63, making sure there was a plan B, C, and D.
Then the ultimate stress test, succession, was managed proactively. Through planned systems for selection, case 62, all culminating in a comprehensive framework for legitimacy, case 70, that rested on consultation, piety, and competence, case 66.
And finally, that long-term endurance, the real staying power, was secured by making the system itself crisis-proof through formalized knowledge transfer, so expertise wasn't lost, case 67, structural separation of powers with checks and balances, case 69, and maintaining an unwavering standard of ethical accountability, especially during tricky transitions, case 68, all while keeping the whole thing unified across growing distances through coordination, case 65.
And the powerful takeaway here, I think the one that really resonates across centuries and applies to almost any complex structure you can think of, a nation, sure, but also a multinational corporation, maybe even a large nonprofit going through a merger, is this fundamental point. The survival, the resilience of any complex system ultimately rests not on the unique genius or charisma of one person, but on the continuity, the ethical resilience, and the careful documentation embedded within its foundational institutions. If the institutions are strong, if they're ethical, if they retain knowledge, they can often withstand periods of weak leadership or sudden shocks.
It's truly remarkable, isn't it, to see how many core concepts of modern governance theory, continuity of operations, rule of law during transitions, checks and balances, knowledge management, are reflected in these foundational decisions made so long ago, all focused on maintaining integrity and function under stress.
And that observation leads us directly, I think, to the final provocative thought we want to leave you, the listener, with today. If the strength of the whole system really rests on the integrity of its institutions, the courts, the treasury, the core administration, then the quality of those institutions is entirely dependent on the quality of the people chosen to lead and run them.
So the question to mull over is this. If strong institutions are the absolute key to survival, how does a governing body ensure that the leaders selected for those powerful institutional roles, the judges, the financial officers, the administrators, the military chiefs, are chosen purely based on merit, on skill, on proven integrity, and not based on other factors like tribal connections, personal wealth, or family privilege?
That fundamental quest for meritocracy, for ensuring the sheer quality of institutional leadership, moving beyond political favors or connections to purely competence-based selection, well, that's exactly what the source material delves into next in cases 71 through 75.
We'll look forward to exploring that in our next deep dive. Thank you for joining us.